hear that's a musician that calls himself the African giant. Anytime I hear people say, oh, he's the African giant, what comes to my mind is when Nigeria was actually called the giant of Africa. The giant of Africa, yes, giant of Africa, where maybe with the large landmass, population, and all of that. But is Nigeria really the giant of Africa? That's why I question when they call this particular person the giant, African giant. And I wonder, African giant that you cannot, you know, talk about the imperialism. You cannot talk about the corruption. You cannot talk about the nepotism, the prebendalism. You cannot talk about the oppression. You cannot talk about the human rights abuses. You cannot talk about, the poverty. You cannot talk about all the issues related to bad leadership, sit-tight syndrome, election manipulation, and all other vices that happen within the African continent. So how giant can you be when, as gigantic as you might call yourself, but your impact is not felt? Yes, we know, just like Nigeria, sixth largest producer of oil in the world, large population, rich country, poor people, good musicians. So also is the African giant, good music, international exposure. But what impact does it have on the common man? I dare to say that the men whose photo you see on the screen, they are the real giant of Africa. Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, the president of Guinea, Niger, these countries who are trying to break Africa away, especially the Francophone part of Africa, away from imperialism that has dwarfed Africa's development today. The Western world, whose economic policies for geared towards improving their own countries and causing so much, poverty in Africa. Africa has so much resources, but very poor people. And these young men are now trying to break that circle of these old folks that have taken Africa to the tunnel of poverty in the last 60 years. These men who serve as super cosmopolitan comprador elites to the Western world. Because how do you explain that there's so much resources in Africa, in Nigeria, in Niger, Burkina Faso, in Rwanda, everywhere, and that Africa is still this poor? Nigeria says the giant of Africa, but Nigeria plays host to the highest number of poor people in the globe. So Nigeria is more or less the poverty capital of the globe. And then what's so giant about Africa? So what's so giant in you? You call yourself African giant. But you can't talk to power. You can't talk about the abnormalities happening in Nigeria. So for me, these men here that you see on the screen, they are the real giant of Africa. They deserve to be called African giants because their strides within the last few years is emancipating their people from poverty, from bad leadership. Because what we see in Africa today, all these old men who are ruling in Cameroon, Nigeria, all these are just appendages of the Western world. They are appendages of imperialists of the G7. They are appendages of the Western powers, using them as stooges, puppets to siphon our resources, puppets to continue to exercise dominance over us in Africa. Because I don't how do you explain how they can send election monitors, people to monitor elections in Nigeria and Africa, but we cannot go and monitor their elections. So much resources. So whether we like it or not, just like what's happened in Nigeria today, Tinubu is just trying to implement the policies of IMF and World Bank just to get legitimacy from the Western world. The same thing happening, because how do you explain Paul Biya 43 years in power and the French government still recognize him? Whoa, can that happen in France? Can one person hold office for that long in France? It's not possible. But they indulge these people because these people are just more or less puppets used to gain access to the resources we have in Africa. It is sad. So, the giants of Africa, I hail you. Thank you for helping us to see that we don't need the West, that democracy is not even what we need for development in Nigeria, in Africa as a whole. Thank you, real African giants.